Hey everyone, and welcome back to Sunday Sound Design. This is episode 17, and we're continuing our deep dive into Ableton Live's audio effects, which you can find in Ableton Live 11.1 suite. We're working through in alphabetical order. We are in the C's right now. Today we're talking about a really simple but highly useful device, and that is channel EQ. So what we do on each episode of Sunday Sound Design is dive into some concept related to sound design. And in today's episode, again, like I mentioned, we're going to walk through channel EQ. So let me show you one thing up front, and then I want to show you an image to kind of help you figure out what channel EQ is trying to replicate, if that makes sense. So let's dive over into Ableton Live. We're going to go to Live's browser and we're going to click this show hide button in the upper left-hand corner of Live screen. And then I want you to click this audio effects button here to take us to the audio effects. Now, I've been showing this every single week, but I want to continue to show it in case this is your first time you've watched one of these videos in the series. Your audio effects may look a little different than mine. So yours may in fact look like this, where your audio effects are grouped in folders. Now, I personally do not like this. I know a few folks that do like this. They like the groupings. They can work faster. It actually works slower because I guess I'm not smart enough to remember where each effect falls into what category. And so I have to think about that. And I don't want anything getting in the way of creativity. And so to get out of this, in case you don't like it like me, you can right click in audio effects here and choose this group and folder to deselect that. Okay. So today we are talking about channel EQ. Again, we're working through and making our way through this list in alphabetical order. So today we're landing on channel EQ. Now, what in the world is channel EQ? The best way to think about this is think of a channel strip on a mixing console. So I just Googled studio mixing board. You could Google like studio mixing console, but I wanted to find an image here to show you. And this is an image we've probably all seen, whether you've been in a recording studio or not. And a modern recording studio has less of a giant console like this. But if you look at this, this image, basically what you have is you have a fader, and then you have what's called a channel strip. So it's typically some channel EQ, it's gain, maybe it's monitoring. If you're using a console like this PreSonus Studio Live for maybe like a live thing, then you have less of a true channel strip, but you have a fader, and then you have your EQ that's either going to show up virtually or you're going to change EQ settings there. And so channel EQ is essentially functioning as like a channel strip, right? It's a kind of just basic EQ to notch things out, to change things, to fix problems. It's an EQ that you're likely going to print on that channel, okay, which means like record in place. So let's dive into channel EQ. Let's load that in, and we'll just talk about how, I mean, this is going to be a really quick video. I want to walk through the basic settings of channel EQ, talk about kind of the mindset and the way I approach it, and then show you one of my favorite things as a potential way to use this that you may want to use it for. So to demo this out, let's go to an instrument here. And let's do like a pad type sound. Okay. So I'm just going to create a really quick pad by dragging in Wavetable. This is what we did kind of on earlier episodes of Behind the Spacebar here. Okay. So there's kind of our pad sound. We're going to just really quickly make this hopefully sound pretty good. Let's do an audio effect here. I know these are not the audio effects we talked about that we were going to use, but I'm still going to use it. We'll do a little hybrid reverb here. All right, so I'm going to work really, really quickly here to achieve what I'm looking for. Okay, so there's my reverb, and then final thing in the line here, I'm going to place an auto filter. Okay. Okay, so that's essentially my reverb for this. This is what I'm doing. That'll work for me, right? It's not great, it's not perfect, but there's my pad sound. Okay, so that's going to work. It got quite a bit of ring out on there, but that's going to work for me. So let's talk about channel EQ. So let's delete these other tracks here. Channel EQ for me is like, it's like the first defense against problematic EQs. I think of it as a channel strip. So when I plug something in to my mixing console, that's like the first thing I reach for. Maybe I go to an EQ with more bands and more things to like fix problems, but channel EQ is just let me take an initial stab at this and see what it's like. So to load it into our instrument today, and we could use this on vocals, on synthesizer tracks, pad tracks like this, whatever we're using. I'm going to just double click and that's going to load it onto this track. If I had a lot of tracks in my set, maybe a better way to do this would be to click and drag it to that specific track. Okay. So let's say that this track, this sound tends to get maybe a little muddy, a little too much, maybe low end or kind of mid range. Then what I could do, I'm just going to play a sound for a second. What I could do is just really quickly use the channel EQ to say, okay, let's boost a little of our high end. Okay, let's cut some of our mids. And let's maybe boost some of our low end. We'll like scoop our EQ here, kind of classic Metallica heavy metal style if I'm playing guitar. And so channel EQ is just a real quick way to make changes. Now I don't have tons of settings, tons of options here, but I do want to walk through the few things that we have access to really quickly. The first one here is a low cut or a high pass. So Ableton calls this a high pass filter, which is the same thing as low cut. This is typically when you look at an audio console, you'll see like a 48V button, and then you'll see this sign here. Let's see if I can zoom in. There we go. So you see that sort of sign there, which is like cutting the lows off, right? And so that's what we have here. And so just as a real quick tool, anything that you don't typically want tons of low end on, a vocal, maybe an acoustic guitar or something, an electric guitar, you plug in, you're like, there's just too much mud in the low end. Then I'm just going to click that to cut that out. Now that's going to counteract what I did by boosting the lows. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense in this context. But if I want that, then I can cut the lows. Now moving here between our EQ bands, we can boost our low end, we can cut our low end. And this lets us carve this out a little more specifically. Okay. So we can go plus 15, minus 15 by kind of carving that out. Again, we could turn off our low pass there, or low cut rather. And get like pretty drastic, or we can leave that high pass on, and that's kind of as far as we can go. So it looks like that cuts us off at, I can't tell exactly what that is, but, if we leave our high pass on, our low cut on, then it's going to, notch us out. Like the most we could boost our low end is, what would you say? 6 dB or whatever. Effectively by doing that. Now let's go to lows. So lows is let's go to mids rather. We can boost our mid-range or we can cut our mid-range. But how do we determine which part of our mid-range band that we want? What part of the frequency? So if we go up here, and this is typically what you would see on an EQ, you would see a couple different options here, like your mid, and then you'd see like maybe a Q or a frequency. And so what we could do is adjust this. By default, this is 1.5 K, but I can move this around and try to find like a problematic area. It could be a little more like a high end thing. It could be a little more like a low end thing, but kind of find that space. And then I could choose to boost it or to cut that problematic area. Now there is no cue that allows me to determine how wide or sharp that is. So again, if you need something that's a little more precise, that's where we're going to go to the actual EQ8 effect, or we could use some auto filters, whatever, to notch things out. But channel EQ is just a real kind of basic, let's cut a little mid-range, let's do whatever. Then next we have our highs, right? So we can bump up 15, we can drop down 15 dB. Typically a lot of times, the appropriate way to use EQ is to use subtractive EQ, to not typically boost. But a lot of times on a vocal, maybe bring it in if it's a little dark, just as a cheap kind of trick, I'll boost a little high end, and channel EQ maybe like the first step, the kind of channel strip to make that happen. And then the final thing here is we have an output switch, which will allow us to say, okay, minus 12 dB, plus 12 dB of our process signal. So this is not a dry wet. But this is, hey, taking everything that we've processed and adding that through. And that kind of makes sense when you think of a channel strip, because you're not going to choose how much of your EQ you want in your channel strip, because you're basically EQing the source, if that makes sense. This is something you're printing. This is something you're recording. You're just really quickly kind of dialing stuff in, getting it right, and you're going to print that and you're going to record that. Okay. So let me show you a way I would typically use channel EQ. Again, this is something I'm going to do more with like EQ 8 because I'm going to find problematic stuff in cut, but just channel EQ really quickly if I'm like using this and I notice that something doesn't sound great, but I'm not sure exactly where that is or exactly why. This is how I would do that. So this is more of just kind of a general EQ process that I'll typically do. But let's play this sound. And that's very loud. I apologize. Let's bring our output back down 12 dB. Okay. So something in the mid-range I don't love. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually boost my mids up. Then I'm going to use my frequency here to find where it is that I don't love. Then I'll show you what I'm going to do then. So that's a little more like low end that I don't love. Gets a little muddy, like 160. So here's what I'm going to do. Now that I've found that quote unquote problematic area, and I could use my EQ 8 to make this wider or more narrow, adjust the band. But this is just a quick kind of fix. I'm going to then take and just pull my mids down. Okay. And depending on what band you get, like that may be pretty lifeless. And I would say pretty much by all stretch of the imagination, that no longer sounds very good. But in the middle of a mix, you know, I can add a little bit of back. I don't have to go super drastic. And based on the mix and the context of what I'm using, that may be right. That may be what I actually need to do. And then highs, you know, again, I would just kind of play. Typically, I'm going to cut as opposed to add, but who the heck cares? Like, if it sounds good to me, maybe that's great. Like, and that's my starting point of what I want. Maybe I just need a little makeup gain, or a little gain boost, a little more volume. Why not? Use channel EQ in that way, which is super helpful. So this is kind of how I would approach channel EQ. It's a real simple effect, but it's going to be something that, again, that's not going to help notch out specific things, but just kind of really quickly get you to something that hopefully works. But let me show you, I think, a potentially unique way to use channel EQ. So let's add an audio track. We're going to do Command T to add the audio track in. And then I'm going to go to channel EQ. I'm going to drop this in. I want to make Ableton Live function a little more like a mixing console. So on my audio track, I've loaded in channel EQ, and I want this to be there by default. So every time I open an Ableton Live session, every time I go to record, every time I plug my keyboard in, whatever it is, I want there to be a channel EQ. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to right click on the track title bar for this audio track. We're going to go down to the bottom here. We're going to do save as default audio track. Okay. So here's what's really cool about this. Now that I've saved that, let's open a brand new live session. Okay. So Command in. We're going to say don't save. I don't want to save my terrible pad sound I made. And I just want to go to an audio track here. So these audio tracks were loaded by default. So let's go add a new audio track, Command T. Right. And look what happens right here on track 4. My channel EQ automatically comes into that audio. So what's really cool, you can work quickly in the studio and say, yeah, let's plug your keyboard in, Command T. I've got my audio track here. Keyboard player plays, you go notch some of the mids out, maybe you boost a little high, and you just automatically add your low cut into there, maybe add a little back, and you're ready to go. And so that's a really helpful, useful way to add your channel EQ, and you can add other effects as well too. But I think channel EQ is one that makes perfect sense, honestly, to add to your track. If you want to get rid of it, then here's how you would get rid of that if you want to zero that back out. So I did Command T to add a new audio track here. Let's delete this. All right. So I'm just getting it back to its default state. And then I'm going down and right clicking, going down to save as default audio track. Default audio track already exists. Do you want to override it? Yes, I do. And then now let's add a new audio track, Command T, and you'll notice that channel EQ is no longer there. So that's a deep dive. Again, it's not a whole lot that we could go through on channel EQ, but hopefully that helps give you a little context of how to use it, how to approach it, some useful tools and tips and techniques as to how to use that. But next week, we're going to continue our journey. Let's see, what do we have coming up next week? Chorus dash ensemble. This is a fun effect that I use a lot, particularly on pads, that I think you guys will enjoy. So next week, we're going to be continuing our walkthrough of audio effects in Ableton Live. If you want to see that content, you've got to hit subscribe to the YouTube channel, and you've got to hit the bell icon so you're notified as soon as we post new content. We'll be back next Sunday, 10 a.m. Central, as we continue our deep dive into Ableton Live's audio effects. Thanks so much for watching this video. I'll see you next week, 10 a.m. Central. Take care, everyone. Bye.